The Louis Burke Frumkes Center for Writing and Culture at Hunter College has presented free talks for the public by best-selling authors and great thinkers on the college's Upper East Side campus.
Hi, did you enjoy it?
Those of you who are writers know what I'm talking about. You have a little voice in your head drives you crazy.
We're dancing with words, prancing with words.
As a result of the 2020 coronavirus pandemic and required social distancing, public gatherings such as our remaining 2 talks for the spring semester have unfortunately been canceled.
Thank goodness we've recorded it.
Center Director Louis Frumkes has had each of the talks recorded for archives and to provide a copy of the talk to the speaker on DVD.
We have some incredible scientists coming.
That the universe just began.
Given the need for intellectual stimulation during this troubling time, the Frumkes Center is making many of our past talks available to view for a limited time each week. Stay tuned to our website for more information about the videos available each week.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Louis Frumkes. Many of you are probably sick of seeing me already. Anyway, I direct the Writing Center in Continuing Ed, and I am thrilled to see you here this evening. You've all got the programs, the brochures, so you know some of the events that are taking place. Last Friday, or a week ago Friday, Steven Pinker and Rebecca Goldstein were here, and it was an immense crowd and really a bravura performance by those 2 cultural icons, and I think everybody really enjoyed it. And when Stacy Schiff was here, she was wonderful. So I think all of what we try to do is showcase wonderful cultural events for Hunter College that are not necessarily through the academic line, but open to the public and to the students. And we provide refreshments and book signings, and we hope you will not only enjoy them, but that you will tell your friends and come, because the venues for these sorts of programs are getting smaller and smaller as the economy shrinks. And we are still trying to mount this kind of program, but we need support and we need help. And I'm not asking for financial support. I'm asking just to support the program if you enjoy it and come back. Hi, Charlie. Tonight, we have a wonderful, wonderful speaker. She's a friend and a great writer, Alice McDermott, whom I've known for some time. I'm a big fan of her work, and I'm sure you are, and probably that's why you're here. But should there be anyone among you who has not read Alice's work, I urge you to do so. And I also would let you know that after her little talk, and you'll be able to ask questions, she will be happy to inscribe books for you that are for sale in the back, and we also have cookies and coffee if you haven't already enjoyed them. So with that said, let me introduce Alice formally. In my opinion, Alice McDermott is one of America's finest writers. In the opinion of the literary community, Alice McDermott is also one of America's finest writers. I feel that way about Alice because I love her books and think they are beautifully written. Others cite that Charming Billy won the National Book Award in 1998, that night was a finalist for the National Book Award, the PEN/Faulkner Award, and the Pulitzer Prize, or that After This, published in 2006, was also a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, or that Alice has been, and still is, a professor of the humanities at Johns Hopkins University, or that she has written stories for The New Yorker, been a writer in residence here or there, or received the Whiting Award, or that in 2012 she occupies the Peter and Margaret D'Angelo Endowed Chair for the Humanities at St. John's University. And she just told me that she misses teaching in Italy, where she taught summers in Florence. But I'm sure you get the point. Alice can really tell a story well enough that if you haven't read one of her books, you are making a major mistake. I'm sure you believe me. So after Alice charms you for a little while and answers a few questions, and I've already said this and I'm repeating myself, we will have refreshments in the back of the faculty dining room where Alice will be happy to inscribe books. That all said, here is Alice McDermott.
Good evening. Thank you, Louis. As always, an excellent host. Can you hear me? Is that all right? Am I speaking directly into the microphone? Thank you for being here. It's wonderful to have any excuse to come to New York, but to accept Louis's invitation to come to Hunter is especially wonderful. I'm not here to sell books tonight because my next novel will be out. I haven't given it up yet, so it will either be out at the end of the year or about this time next year. I've grown very superstitious about reading from works in progress. As I get older, I've grown very superstitious about just about everything. But I had the unusual circumstance of having an excerpt of this novel that will be out sometime within the next year, published recently in a local magazine. And I'm sort of finding myself unusual, but the wonderful thing about this career is that every book is a different animal and every story is a new adventure, and you're always a novice at this novelist business because you're always having a new experience, telling a new story, teaching yourself the story, trying to discover the right way to tell it. So I have this sort of unusual sense that there's a little piece of this larger novel that's kind of gone out like a scout, you know, in the old cowboy movies, and gone out into the world almost in spite of me. So I thought what I'd do tonight is just read a little bit of this short story that popped out of this continuing saga. And maybe give you a little sense of what's coming, and maybe we can talk a little bit about it, and I may even, I'm hoping, this often happens when I teach, if I can talk to you about this little piece, maybe I'll figure out some things I still haven't figured out yet about it. The title of the story when it was published was Someone. On the sidewalk in front of St. Mary Star of the Sea, a Sunday morning in early June 1937, when Marie was 17, Walter Hartnett said, "What's wrong with your eye?" Their mothers were talking, purses over their arms and hats on their heads, the sunlight reflecting brightly off the black glass of windshields, the tin fenders, the pocketbooks of the women in that aftermath crowd. Off Walter, too, when she looked up at him, his dark hair and that white face, gray eyes translucent in the sunshine. "Nothing wrong with it," she said. "This one just screws up on me sometimes, when the sun's strong." "Well, don't let it," he said. "It makes your whole face look funny." Back home, in the tiny mirror above the narrow bathroom sink, she saw it. How the right eye, when squinted closed, pulled at the corner of her mouth so that she looked like a tough with a wad of chewing gum in her cheek. How her glasses, thick bottle bottoms, stayed steady on her nose despite the contortions of the face behind them. She was reminded for a moment of Walter Hartnett as a boy, the way he had held his hands behind his back, placid and wise behind blind Bill Corrigan, who had served as the umpire for every stickball game on her street. Games that Walter Hartnett would not join because of his bad leg. She was reminded of the sagacity with which Walter would nod whenever Bill Corrigan, who had been gassed in the war and spent his days in the kitchen chair that his mother brought to the sidewalk every morning, made his impossible calls, as if only he and the blind man could see what the rest of them could not. She opened up the offending eye, smiled at the mirror and said, "How's that?" Took her glasses off entirely and smoothed the skin under her eyes and said, "Is that better? Walter Hartnett? Mr. Hartnett?" Brushed her hair back, dark and thick, but like the scrunching eye with a will of its own, peered into the small mirror which showed her now only a smear of face and hair and smiling teeth, made her eyes as large as she could make them, and said out loud, "Is that better, Mr. Walter Hartnett?" When he called her that afternoon, his voice a small and miraculous thing inside the big black receiver, he said he was sorry if he had been rude. It was none of his business, he said, what she did with her eyes. Later, reconstructing the conversation during what was to be the first night of her life that sleep escaped her entirely, she replied, "Not at all." But at the time, she had barely murmured a word. "I'm bossy sometimes," he said. "I get it from where I work. They give me a lot of responsibilities. Do you want to go out for a soda?" When her daughters began dating, she told them, "Here's a good rule. If he looks over your head while you're talking, get rid of him." Walter Hartnett. But by then, they would throw up their hands. "Jesus, Mom, no more Walter Hartnett stories." Walter Hartnett, on the candy store stool, looked over her head every time a figure appeared in the doorway behind her. It got so that she felt she could see them too, the other people coming in and out of the evening sun, as if she could feel their cool shadows on her back as they stood for a moment in silhouette, and he looked up to see who it was. "Hiya," he'd say if he knew them, even if she was in mid-sentence. "How are ya?" He'd shoot a finger up beside his face to signal hello, or just stare. This was for strangers, his eyes following whoever it was into the candy store, wondering, calculating, assessing as a man alone might do, a man alone and unguarded in the brazenness of his gaze. And then his gray eyes would drop to her face once more. There would be a second of utter indifference, boredom perhaps, and then a slow dawning. "Oh yeah, you." A slow warming of his attention as his attention returned to her. "Well, I'm happy to be here with you." Sometimes even as much as a smile entering those dark-lashed eyes before they flicked upward again. It must have been second nature to him, this veering attention, but for her it was both devastating and thrilling, so that by the time they had finished their sodas and slipped from their stools, she was unsteady on her feet from the dizzying turns that her hopes, her heart, had been taking. Her pumps caught somehow against his built-up shoe, and in the tangle as she fell into him, he slipped his warm hand under her arm. "Not very graceful," he said, but they were both blushing. Out on the sidewalk again, they walked without touching, although most of the other people on the street seemed to be couples, young and old, strolling arm in arm, the Sunday evening promenade. The sun was setting with that thick orange light, but the sky to the east was still a cool morning blue. There was only the slightest ear rhythm in Walter's gait, a nearly imperceptible hitch, not a limp. Had he turned right and walked her silently to her stoop, she would have followed, her head down, and said nothing more. But he turned left instead, and she went with him. He was talking about his job, how it was steady, and he was lucky to have it. He named some friends who had jobs he wouldn't wish on a dog, with the BMT, with the diocese, on a barge that plied the harbor. He told her to forget about Lower Manhattan and head to Borough Hall when the time came to look for work, Who wanted to work in New York City? All the while, his eyes following the other couples they passed or darting to the opposite side of the street to see who was there. When he stopped, she thought perhaps it was because he had recognized someone ahead. But then he turned to her, and now, in the light of the street lamp, his eyes reacquainted themselves with her face again, indifference once again warming into pleasure. He pointed to the brownstone behind him. "I've got to run upstairs for a minute," he said, his voice full of a reluctance to leave her that well matched his newly recalled delight at her presence. "You want to come up or wait here?" "This your house?" she said, and he only cocked his head to convey, "Whose house do you think it is?" "I'll come up," she told him. He and his mother lived on the top floor, as she and her mother did. Widows in aviaries, he would say some time later. He let himself in, calling "Ma," but all the lights were off. He reached for a small lamp, pulled it on. Its amber shade and the bulb beneath it swayed a little. "She must have gone out," he said. "Have a seat. I won't be a minute." He walked through the living room into the adjoining dining room and then into another room, the kitchen perhaps. She sat. The couch was covered in a dark blue brocade, lace doilies on the arms and across the back. There was a painting of the Holy Family above the boarded-up fireplace, a water glass holding fading lilacs on the mantelpiece. 2 more heavy chairs in the same midnight blue brocade faced her. On the small table between them, there were 4 oval photographs. She stood up and crossed over to them. A wedding portrait of Walter's parents, the father looking much as Walter would, with a big mustache. A portrait of Walter as a baby, wide-eyed and propped up from behind, and then in knickers and a white collar, a huge First Communion ribbon on his arm, and then, looking exactly like himself, although more thoughtful and more solemn, in his graduation gown. She felt a twinge of envy. Envy for the widowed mother who had known Walter all his life, who had heard his first words, dried his first tears, had they been for the shortened leg. She even envied the mustachioed father, now buried in Calvary Cemetery, where her father too was gone, envied every happy moment Walter had lived that had no trace of her in it. She heard his voice coming from the back of the apartment. He was on the phone. He seemed to be speaking seriously. Was it his important job? A lifetime later, she still couldn't say whether the phone call had been a ruse. She returned to the couch. When he came back into the living room, he was carrying 2 open bottles of beer. He offered, and she refused, laughing a little at what struck her as the preposterousness of the idea, and he looked at the brown bottle and said, "Oh, but it's already open," as if she had broken a promise. He placed the rejected beer on the radiator cover beside him and then sat next to her on the couch. "My mother should be back soon," he said, looking her over, her throat, her blouse, her belt, her hands in her lap. "She'll want to say hello to you." She nodded, pointed to the portrait on the small table. "Is that her wedding picture?" she asked, and he said, "Yeah." "She was pretty," she said. "I wouldn't mind getting married," he told her, and then took a drink of his beer. He began to talk about his job again. What a good job it was. What an easy thing it would be for him to begin to save his money to get a nice place of his own for when he got married. He sat very close to her. Did she want to get married, he asked, and when she said, sure she did, someday, that slow, delighted recognition in his eyes fell on her again. He leaned away as if to see her better. They might have been the only 2 people in all the vast universe who agreed that they would like to get married someday. He took such pleasure in her answer. "And children?" he asked. Did she want to have children? Well, sure. Well, sure. His eyes, darker now in the dim light of the apartment, were on her alone, on her face, as if she were the very thing they had been searching for all evening. When he leaned to kiss her, it was both her first real kiss and her first taste of beer. He held the beer bottle against her shoulder for a minute as he pressed toward her, dampening her blouse. Then he lowered his arm across her lap to put the bottle on the floor, and moving up again, put his hand on her breast. Astonished and, perhaps, afraid, already she had learned the triumph and distress of his veering attention. She made no move. Delicately, she thought at first he was making an okay sign with thumb and forefinger just over her heart. He unbuttoned her shirt, then slipped his fingers into her bra, pulling it aside. Her breast, exposed to the shadowy room, seemed lit with its own light. He sighed and bowed his head. She felt the momentary terror of not knowing what he was going to do as he moved his mouth toward her, and then felt it increase 100-fold when she understood. He closed his mouth over her nipple. He pulled and tugged. Of course, she had seen women nursing babies here and there in closed-off rooms, and it was this recollection that muddled her emotions now. He breathed deeply like an infant nursing, and she felt the warm air of his nostrils on her skin. He put his hand to her spine and pressed her toward him. She felt his teeth on her flesh lightly at first, but then in a stinging grip that made her pull in her breath. He clamped harder, and she cried out, which only made him turn his head slightly as if to get a better grip on her with his molars. He might have drawn blood if there hadn't been a sudden slam of the door in the downstairs vestibule. He paused, lifted his head. Slam of the interior door and footsteps across the foyer. He said, "Cover up," and then reached across her lap for the beer on the floor. Her poor, pale breast was soggy and tender, the pink nipple distended. She fumbled for her buttons. He leaned back on the couch, seemed to roll himself off it, the beer in one hand and the other hand pressed to his thigh. He walked, stooped, really limping now, toward the bottle he had left on the radiator. But then they heard the rattle of keys and another door opening on a floor below. He cursed, and with his back to her hung his head, shaking it sorrowfully. And then, without another word, he limped out of the room again. For a few minutes, she sat alone under the shaded light. She imagined she felt a warm trickle of blood moving down her chest. When he came back, he had washed himself, hands and face, and combed water through his hair. He no longer had the bottle of beer, but he swung the second one off the radiator cover and carried it to one of the dark chairs on the other side of the room. He sank into the chair and took a drink. "When we get married," he said, "you're probably going to want to live on the parlor floor, baby carriages and all that. But I think it's cheap. Everybody and his brother walking by your door. I think it's better to be up high." He finished off the bottle in 2 or 3 long gulps and put his hand to his chest and quietly belched, as if they were already married and had been for quite some time. "I guess you'd better go," he said amicably. They walked down the stairs. She felt a panic at each turning. If his mother came through the door now, what would she read on their faces? But he took his time. On the street, the air was lovely, a slight breeze had kicked up and it felt like bath water against her skin. He put his arm around her waist as they walked. They passed the church. Was it only this morning that he had looked down at her with the sunlight across his face and asked, "What's wrong with your eye?" "Well, at least," he said, "we won't have to fight over whose church we'll get married in, yours or mine. Both our mothers will be happy. What do you have?" he asked. "One more year to graduation, right?" She said yes. "Get a job downtown," he said. "You don't want to go into New York City." When they reached her stoop, he paused. "Here you are," he said. He put his hands in his pockets and shifted a little on his uneven legs. He may have been feeling the 2 quick bottles of beer. There was a couple walking down the other side of the street toward the subway, and his eyes followed. This time, she turned to gaze at them too. The woman wore a tight skirt across her wide bottom, and her heels were clicking. The man's suit jacket was long, with a belt across the back. Together, she and Walter turned to face each other again, but this time he did not go through that momentary, disinterested amnesia. Rather, he raised his chin and shot a finger into the air, as he had done when acknowledging people in the candy store and on the street, a wordless, "I know you," and then let his eyes fall and linger on her breast, the one he had exposed and suckled. He grinned, "I know you." She felt both the thrill of his acknowledgement and a hot black rush of shame. "Go on in," he said, touching her hip. "Go tell your mother you've got a boyfriend." 3 years before, driving home from Calvary Cemetery, she had sunk into the sweetest sleep she had ever known. They had put her father in the ground, and her world was shattered, but the nap she had had in the hired car was like a long draught of cool water, deep and fragrant, washed with an ivory light, the kind of sleep, she would later learn, that came only in the aftermath of many tears. When the car pulled up to the curb in front of the restaurant where the funeral luncheon was to be held, her mother gently woke her. Only her brother, Gabe, in his Roman collar then, disapproved. His own eyes were red-rimmed and bloodshot. There were shadows on his pale cheeks. "You slept?" he said, disbelieving. He had ridden in front, beside the driver. "How could you have slept?" Now, lying beside her mother in the bed they shared, because Gabe had come home from his first parish saying only that the priesthood was not for him, she wondered if such easy sleep would ever come to her again. She knew that she could not put her hand to her bruised and tender breast for fear that her mother would see what she was doing, but neither could she think of any other way to tamp down the smoldering wire of shame that was coiling down her spine. A thrilling kind of shame that made guilt and confusion feel like pleasure, like joy. She was in love. Walter Hartnett, with the gray eyes, loved her. Next year, they would be married in St. Mary's Star of the Sea, and those eyes would never again fall on her with cold indifference. "I know you." Her mother said, in the darkness, "Do you want some hot milk, Marie?" "No," she said. "Can't you sleep?" "No," she said. "Can't you at least try to be still?" her mother said. "It's 3 a.m. I've got to work in the morning." "Sorry," she whispered. The ticking of the bedside clock had never before sounded so cruel. The windows were broad, uneven strokes of pale gray, hastily painted on the long black wall beyond the bed. What sounds came from the street were distant, indistinguishable. Everyone else was still. Everyone else had fallen into the cool, ivory light, fallen asleep. "Is Walter Hartnett a nice boy?" her mother asked. She said yes, but could add nothing more. Her mother rolled over, bouncing the mattress they shared, then pulled the thin sheet up over her shoulder. "I like his mother," she said. "Her people are from Armagh." Thank you. Oh, there's more to it than that. But I just realized, since I have a room full of mostly New Yorkers, I had a humorous discussion with the editor about the word scrinching. Now, I say that's a New York word. It's not in a dictionary, and if you type it into a computer, you'll get that little annoying red line under it. But scrinching is like, it's not quite squinting, it's like squinting with your nose and your mouth as well. When people come and visit New York, they scrinch up at the Empire State Building, right? They go on the subway and they scrinch, you know. It's a word, you know. And they gave it to me. The editor conceded that it was a New York word, and even though it's not in any dictionary, we were allowed to have it. So I got it into print for us, for all of us. You have a question, yes?
How do you find
inspiration and some subject to write your novel? Because if I compare, because I'm from Europe originally and now I'm New Yorker too, and of course in the last 100 years in Europe was 50 wars, 25 revolutions, and here was really nothing, only you send the troops to some wars in Europe and Near East. And of course, a few months ago I saw some duodrama, Strip and Foster, they discussed their lives. It was like between number of World Series, number of Super Bowls, starting one wedding, divorce, taking psychiatric visits and pills. Well, this was just, of course, joke about their lives, and I think it's a difficult, even now, even we in crisis, of course. Later, maybe in next year, we don't know, maybe much more topic subject to inspiration. How did you find, if you compare, you go to some trip to Latin America, to Europe, to Africa, and you bring and you try a project on tranquility, Sea of United States?
Well, thank you. I think that the idea of a fiction writer going off out into the wider and exotic world and having all these wonderful experiences and then coming back and writing them was one I entertained for a very long time before I actually became a writer. That romantic Ernest Hemingway model. The difficult thing about going off and seeing the world is that while you're doing it, you're not getting any writing done. And the hard part about this profession is not having lots of experiences. It's being alone at a desk and trying to renew language so that you can describe those experiences in a way that quite hasn't been done before. And to transform those experiences, whether they're exotic or domestic, to transform those experiences into something that all of us can look at in a new way. You know, there are many, as many writers as there are as many explanations for where they get their inspiration from. I was a very young writer, had just published a first novel, and I was on a panel with an august woman novelist and another first novelist, and a question much like yours came up: how do you get your inspiration? And the well-respected, many books under her belt writer leaned forward and said, "I get it from the Holy Spirit." And the other first novelist immediately jumped up and said, "So do I." And I thought, I'm in the wrong profession. I'm screwed, because the Holy Spirit has yet to descend on my desk or my typewriter. I don't have any inspiration. I just work really hard, and I write a lot, and write until something begins to seem authentic, until I have the sense that I'm using language to the best of my ability to convey something that will be recognizable, with no other agenda than that. I'm not a historian, I'm not a social scientist, I'm not a philosopher, I'm not out to convince anybody of anything. I just think language is one of our greatest gifts, and that our common humanity and what it is all of us are dealing with in our time on Earth can best be recognized through the working of words, in the freedom that fiction gives you in the working of words. Sorry? Yeah. No, see, that's all the romantic stuff. That's what you want to do, you know. I mean, that's the life that gets you into it because it looks so wonderful. And then you realize if you keep walking in Central Park, you're going to have lots of great ideas and not much on the page. So the sense of 8 or 9 hours of a really dull-looking life. This is why Hollywood can never really portray what writers do. They have to show them riding on elephants or walking through Central Park with music playing in the background, or actually a wonderful novel made into not my favorite film was The Hours, but I really had to laugh out loud when the only way they could show Virginia Woolf riding was to have her stare up in space and move her lips. You know? That's as close as Hollywood could get to what goes on. You can't dramatize it. It's you know, it's the silence of the room. The wonderful thing about reading and writing is that it's the only thing that is simply one inner voice speaking to another. A reader lends his or her inner voice to the writer. The writer hears the words up here, works to get them on the page, and then that voice with which we speak to ourselves. It's not a voice we ever really speak out in the world with. But that voice with which we speak to ourselves, that's the voice we lend to a writer. So that the silent voice in the writer's head is exchanged between two people, reader and writer, one at a time. It's a great gift, and it's beautiful, but in order to get it, that writer has to hear that voice and get it on the page, and that just means a lot of time spent working on words.
How many hours a week do you write, and how often do you rewrite it?
Well, those are two very different questions. I learned also very early in my career. I learned that if I didn't treat this writing of fiction as if it were a real job, nobody else would. You know, I mean, I grew up on Long Island, a middle-class family. Both my brothers became engineers and lawyers. You know, so here we had this Irish Catholic get a good job with the telephone company, make sure that you can take stenography, you know, have a good health benefits and a pension. You know, all that stuff is gone. But as I was so for me to say, oh, I think I'll go off and write fiction. You know, my family said, we're not interested in the stories you tell us over the kitchen table. Who's going to be interested in anything you've actually written down? So it was that sense of, okay, I'm going to act as if this is a job with the telephone company. And even if I'm not getting my hourly wage and I'm not getting my benefits, I'm going to be at my desk at 9 and I'm going to work through till 5. And that's the only way I could take myself seriously, and sometimes it helps other people to take you seriously. You know, 30 years down the road of writing this, I still have friends who call me in the middle of the day and they say, are you writing? And I say, yes. And they say, oh, good, because I really need to talk to you. You know, it's not like I can't, I'm at work and the boss says, I can't talk to you until after 5. There's still that sense of, you're just making this stuff up and, you know, you can stop and you can go back. So it's that, take it seriously, give that time to it. And so I teach 1 day a week, 4 days a week at my desk, you know, as much as possible, given family and all those other things that are in life. And revision is something I just do constantly. I never know what draft I'm on. I rewrite everything I wrote the day before the next day, and then I rewrite that, and then I was a graduate student when I heard Gail Godwin, the novelist, say that she, her first drafts were on yellow paper, her second drafts were on blue paper. I had another one of those moments, well, I don't know what I'm doing because I don't know what draft I'm on. I couldn't possibly know what color paper to put it on.
Yes. I read someone in The New Yorker, and I was wondering if
the character of Marie, what happened to her, her disability, the setting, is any of it inspired by something from your own life or something, or someone else you know? Because it seemed very particular, very, at least, you know, the particular disability.
Uh-huh.
It seemed that it might have been taken from something that you knew of personally, or a family story, some heartbreak that someone you know experienced, or was it completely your imagination?
The particulars of her life have no corollary in my own life. You know, I always worry about saying it's completely imagination, because that means that I made up St. Mary's Star of the Sea, which I didn't. It's in Brooklyn, you know, and that means I made up stools in candy stores, and I didn't in those days if you went to the candy store. But the particulars of her life, this is a novel that, and again, every novel has a different genesis and a different way of coming to some kind of maturity. And this was a character I had. This is probably, well, there's two reasons why it's taken me so long. I've been working on two novels at the same time, which is like really bad. Don't do it. I do not advise that. But it's just the way I work. It only means it takes you twice as long to get one of them finished. And also, this was a novel whose story I did not know until I started writing. And it was really writing to find out. My goal was only to somehow trace the arc of ordinary, if you want to call her that, an ordinary woman's life. And I think a little bit of what I've been after here is, I can only equate it to, there's a wonderful play by Tom Stoppard, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, which sort of switches the backstage of Hamlet to the front of the stage. And in some ways, I like that idea. And probably the really interesting characters in this novel are not my main character. I wanted the ordinary woman's life with other people around having somewhat more complex lives. Because I just don't think this sort of character has gotten anywhere near the attention she should. But I didn't know who she was, and I didn't know who those other people were. So I had to discover it.
I read the story in the New Yorker also, and so I know the ending, but this is part of a larger novel, is that it?
Yes.
So it almost looked like that was the whole story, but it's going to be more, going to go along with her life, or am I asking too much?
Yeah, I know. No, I'm far enough along that I can say, yeah, it's her story. And I tend not to write something that students love to write, because it sort of gives you a shot at both being a short story writer and a novelist at the same time, and that is novels that are really stories, with reoccurring characters. That doesn't, I love reading it, doesn't appeal to me that much. So I was a little surprised that this excerpt, my agent picked up and thought it would stand on its own. That's not generally, and actually it is an excerpt that's cut down a little bit. In the novel itself, it's a little bit longer. Yes, yeah. So far. I may go back to my desk tomorrow and change it all. Sure. Yes.
What do you think originally made you want to be a writer? Can you see any influences that moved you in that direction?
Well, I think every writer, the obvious answer for every writer is you're a reader. And when you fall in love with reading, when you have that experience of reading something that's beautifully wrought, and that changes the way you look at the world, and also takes you from the world and into this, and again, you get to know characters and get to know fellow human beings through literature in a way you never know anyone else in your life. You hear that inner voice, you understand them, and also you see them in the shapeliness of art, what their lives are like. And I think, if you're a reader first, and you see it done, it's logical to say, wow, I wouldn't mind trying my hand at that. I remember very vividly as a college student finding the stories of Vladimir Nabokov. I had literally, summer vacation, I had gone to the library realizing that I had all kinds of gaps in my reading life, and I literally just walked around the shelves looking for writers I'd heard of whose works I had never read. I knew about Lolita, I hadn't read it, and I just, but I didn't want, it was summer, I only wanted to read short stories, I didn't want to get involved in a whole nother. And I could tell you every single thing about that moment, where I was and how I felt, reading those stories and thinking, if I spent my whole life working at words and trying to write something as good as any one of these, and I never even came close to equaling it, it would have been a great pursuit. It would have been, what a great life. The autobiographical part of it goes back to being in that Irish Catholic Long Island family with a patriarchal father and two smart older brothers who were and still are very opinionated. And writing was my way of completing a sentence when I wasn't usually allowed to complete a sentence at the dinner table.
I hope you pursue the brother who suddenly decides he doesn't want to be a priest.
Oh yeah, he's there. Good. All right. I'm glad to hear that.
Why don't we, gentlemen, too? You can. We'll all. Alice is going to sit at that table back there.
I ask maybe this
okay, go ahead.
Interesting question for everybody, because if you mentioned this, if you write every hour, you won't change your writing. Next day, I feel the same if I'm doing. And what method you have to stop this? You call to your publishing house when I must send you draft number 1 or something, manuscript.
When do you know it's finished, right? Yes, yeah.
How you do practically, because you just going to vacation for 2 weeks and you and after 2 weeks you can a little forget, it looks better than one.
That's what you hope for, yeah. That's a very good question, because there is that sense, and again, this is something that I see my students struggle with, and for me, it's always been, I said the beginning of every novel is different, and the course of its development is different, but discovering that you finished it has always been pretty much the same thing, even even with short stories or anything that I've written. And there's the sense that it's not perfect. I know what's wrong with it. There are probably a million ways to fix it, but at this point in my career, at this point of my life, this is the story I could tell, and I've told it as well as I can, and other stories are now calling to me. So it's fatalistic, but it's also a relief.
And the writing doesn't get much better if you haven't read Alice than her writing. So it's a great model. Please come and meet Alice. She'll be sitting back there. She'll answer other questions, and she'll sign some papers. Please join us for